Some deserts do not swallow men, Lieutenant. They keep what was never theirs. The warning reached Samuel Whitaker before the sun did. At 4:30 in the morning, in a telegraph room that smelled of hot wire and stale coffee, the 34-year-old lieutenant read the message 3 times because the army did not lose trains, especially not a payroll train carrying 40 chests of gold across a guarded stretch of rail in Arizona territory. The message was blunt, almost embarrassed by itself. Black Mesa spur mile marker 47. Engine, 3 cars, escort detail, all missing. No wreckage. No smoke. No bodies. No broken rail. Samuel had spent 12 years learning how the frontier dressed ordinary problems in dramatic language, but this report did not feel dramatic. It felt wrong. By first light he was already in the saddle, a dust coat thrown over his blue army coat, revolver at his hip, notebook in his breast pocket, riding east from Silver Bend Depot with 2 troopers and a head full of practical explanations. Sabotage by thieves. Deserted crew. Washout in the night. A bookkeeping lie invented by a terrified station master. He believed in steel, maps, and orders written in a firm hand. He believed every vanished thing left a trail if a man looked low enough. He stopped believing it quite so firmly an hour later when he found the Apache woman waiting beside the track as if the desert had placed her there. She stood on a flat shelf of red stone above the line, still as a carved figure, buckskin catching the dawn, black hair braided with small silver pieces that flashed once in the early light. Around her neck hung a worn amulet. Her face held the calm of someone who had watched men hurry themselves into trouble for a very long time. One trooper reached for his rifle. Samuel raised a hand before the movement became a mistake. "My name is Mara Natan," she said in clear, even English. "You are riding toward a place my people do not cross after dark." Samuel answered with the kind of politeness officers used when they intended to dismiss a warning without sounding foolish. "An army train disappeared there last night. That is where I am going." "I know," she said. "We heard the iron horse before the moon turned down. We heard it stop. We did not hear it leave." Samuel studied her, unsure whether she was offering help or a legend. Behind her, the Arizona morning opened mile after mile of raw country, low thorn brush, cut stone, pale grass, and distant ridges burned gold by the rising sun. Nothing in that vast clean space suggested a machine large enough to haul gold could simply vanish. "Did your people see anything?" he asked. Mara looked toward the east, toward the place where the line disappeared between 2 dark walls of sandstone. "We saw light where no light should be. We saw men signal from the cliffs with mirrors after sunset. And we saw greed enter sacred ground wearing a uniform and carrying ledgers." One trooper muttered that she was trying to start a ghost story. Samuel almost agreed, but there was no triumph in her voice, only fatigue. She stepped down from the rock and held out a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside lay a brass screw blackened with grease. "I found this beside the rail before dawn," she said. "It does not belong to the desert." Samuel took it, and for the first time that morning the disappearance stopped feeling like an accident. Somewhere ahead of them, a train full of army gold had gone missing without leaving the kind of answer the army could print in a report. Somewhere ahead of them, steel had met stone, profit had met memory, and somebody had decided the easiest lie would be to blame the Apache. Samuel closed his hand around the screw, looked at Mara Natan, and understood that if he wanted the truth, he would have to ride beside the one person who already knew the land was holding it. By the time Samuel and Mara reached mile marker 47, the sun was high enough to bleach the color from every lie, and still the rail told him nothing he recognized. The track ran straight across the wash for nearly half a mile, bright on the ridgeline, then dipped between 2 sandstone shoulders and simply ended in sense if not in metal. The steel was still there, bolted clean and level, but the story stopped. No shattered ties. No spilled coal. No twisted carriage wheel. No deep trench where an engine had jumped the line. The payroll train should have left chaos on both sides of the track. Instead, the place wore an eerie stillness, as if the night had been edited. Samuel dismounted and crouched beside the rail, running gloved fingers over polished iron warm from the sun. He found fresh grease at the joint and faint filings in the dust, too neat to come from ordinary wear. Whoever worked here had touched the line recently, and carefully. 20 feet away sat a dented coffee pot half buried in sand, still smelling faintly bitter. A length of telegraph wire hung from a mesquite branch like an unfinished sentence. One of the troopers swore he could hear a whistle. Mara told him it was wind moving through split stone. She moved through the wash without hurry, studying the ground the way Samuel studied paperwork. At first he saw only confusion, mule tracks crossing boot prints, escort horses milling, a churn patch where men had stopped and turned. Then she pointed with 2 fingers and made him look again. The boot prints formed a pattern, not panic. They had moved in lines toward the western wall, paused, then returned to the rail. There were no prints leading east beyond the gap, yet the train had not reversed. Samuel followed the prints to a flat slab of rock where the dust had been swept away with a blanket or brush. Near its edge he found another brass shaving and the impression of a tool chest. "Portable switch hardware," he said before he could stop himself. Mara glanced at him. Then the train did not vanish. It was invited to turn. The thought hit him harder than the empty track. A hidden spur. A false signal. A planned diversion. That meant knowledge, time, and confidence that the plane would land somewhere convenient. He rose and scanned the cliffs. On the northern wall, almost invisible against the stone, a fragment of mirrored glass flashed once, bright as an eye. One of the troopers lifted his rifle. Samuel lowered the barrel. "No one fires unless I say so." Mara had already started climbing, using cracks and ledges with the ease of someone stepping through her own doorway. Samuel followed less elegantly, dust slipping under his boots, heart pounding with anger rather than fear. At the top they found no scout, no outlaw, no ambush. Only a tripod made from mesquite sticks, a small circle of ash, and a polished signaling mirror set toward the track. Below. Next to it lay a torn scrap from an army freight manifest, the ink smeared except for 2 clean letters at the bottom. G.M. Samuel knew the initials at once. Gideon Mercer, civilian contractor, rail builder, supplier, and a man with enough friends in uniform to make trouble disappear. Mara lifted the mirror and looked at the wash beneath them, where the track shone like a blade. "This land warned them," she said softly. "But men who think in gold do not hear warnings." Samuel folded the scrap into his notebook, and for the first time since the telegram arrived he stopped asking where the train had gone and started asking who wanted the frontier to believe the Apache had taken it. They reached Coyote Switch, the last manned siding west of the wash, near noon, and Samuel discovered that frontier truth always arrived tired, thirsty, and several hours late. The station house leaned against the wind like a man who had heard too many excuses. Inside, the telegraph key sat silent beside a ledger swollen by heat. Station agent Eli Turner, pale from fear and no sleep, insisted the payroll train had passed on schedule just after sundown, engine lamps steady, escort detail alert, contractor Gideon Mercer riding in the inspection car even though his name was not on the movement order. Turner remembered that because Mercer had argued for an unscheduled water stop, and had carried a map tube tucked under his arm like a preacher carrying a Bible. Samuel asked why that was not in the written log. Turner swallowed hard and slid the ledger forward. One page had been torn out with a careful hand. Mara looked around the room, not at Turner but at the things fear had made him forget to hide. A second coffee cup beside the stove. Fresh grit on the floorboards near the rear door. A sliver of blue paint on the window latch, the same blue used on army rolling stock. Samuel questioned Turner again, slower this time, and the man admitted that around dusk a rail hand had delivered a sealed message marked urgent from Fort Mason. Turner never read it. Mercer took it directly and smiled in a way Turner had not liked. Mara stepped outside while Samuel copied names and times. He found her behind the station beside a line of weathered barrels, touching a strip of cloth caught on a nail. It was dark blue wool, not from a laborer's shirt, but from an army coat lining. "Someone in uniform came through the back after the train passed," Samuel said. Mara nodded, then pointed beyond the siding toward the open desert where broken rock rose in layers of rust and amber. "My uncle taught me this route when I was a girl," she said. "There is an old mining road north of here that no rail map shows. It dies at a collapsed silver tunnel called Argent Hollow." Samuel had seen the name once in a territorial survey. Abandoned 20 years earlier. Unsafe. Unprofitable. Forgotten. The kind of place a man like Mercer would remember when everyone else had the sense to let it disappear. Before they could ride out, an Apache elder approached from the mesquite line, slow and straight back despite the heat. Mara greeted him in her own language, then translated for Samuel. His name was Tolan Nantan, Mara's mother's brother. He said the basin ahead was called the listening ground because sound moved strangely there, and strangers who entered after sunset often followed echoes instead of roads. "That is not magic," Samuel said, more defensively than he intended. Tolan's eyes held a faint humor. "No," Mara translated. "It is land. Men from the east give new names to things they do not understand, then act surprised when the old names remain true." Tolan handed Mara a small leather charm stitched with blue beads, and his nizad, a warrior's protection token, and told her the land was restless because iron had crossed it without respect. Samuel did not know what to do with charms, but he knew what to do with maps. He spread Mercer's public survey, his army route sheet, and a territorial mineral chart across the station table. Mara placed a fingertip where the printed line should have met empty desert. Samuel drew a breath. Hidden in the crease of the map, nearly invisible unless the paper was tilted to light, was a penciled spur leading north to Argent Hollow. Not official. Not signed. Not meant to survive close inspection. Someone had built a road for a train that officially did not exist. Samuel folded the maps, thanked Tolan Nantan more seriously than before, and rode out with Mara toward the old mine, carrying the growing certainty that the missing gold was not just stolen money. It was a story being arranged, and every mile east made the intended villain more obvious. The hidden spur was never a true rail line so much as a secret thought hammered into the desert. For 3 miles it ran in broken fragments across the north slope, portable track sections laid over old grading work, then lifted again where stone would reveal too much. Samuel had seen field rail used in mining camps, but never with this kind of discipline. Whoever planned the diversion knew exactly how long a train could be coaxed off the main line, unloaded, and concealed before dawn erased the confidence of everyone involved. He and Mara found the first abandoned section at a dry arroyo where grease-stained ties lay stacked beneath brush. Nearby, tucked into the shade of a boulder, they discovered a man in army bookkeeping sleeves clutching a canteen as if he had just remembered thirst. Edwin Pike, payroll clerk, 30 years old, more ink than grit in his hands, stared at Samuel as if deciding whether rescue was safer than silence. It took him half an hour, 2 long drinks, and Mara's steady refusal to hurry him before the story came loose. Mercer had boarded the train at Coyote Switch with a forged maintenance order and 3 civilian rail hands. 2 miles past the wash, signal mirrors flashed from the cliff. The engineer slowed. Portable switch plates had already been set. Mercer claimed a washout ahead and ordered the train onto what he called an emergency bypass. The escort sergeant argued until a sealed army dispatch was produced bearing Colonel Barrett's authorization. Samuel knew Barrett, or thought he did, a stern officer who worshipped schedules and hated scandal. Hearing his name tied to Mercer made something inside Samuel go cold. Pike said the train followed the hidden spur into the basin just as the moon rose. Then the land began to misbehave. Echoes bounced from wall to wall. Orders sounded as if they came from the wrong direction. One lantern blew out without wind. Another glowed blue through its own glass. The engineer panicked. Mercer ordered the gold offloaded at Argent Hollow before sunrise. Pike had slipped away during the confusion because he realized the written report was already decided. If the plan succeeded, the papers would call it an Apache raid. The missing gold would fund Mercer's partners, and no one low enough to be questioned would outshout a contractor and an army colonel. Samuel wrote every word in his notebook, though the pen bit harder into the page when Barrett's name returned. Mara listened with the stillness of someone collecting pieces she already suspected existed. When Pike finished, she asked only one question. "Did you see Apache tracks?" Pike shook his head immediately. "No. I saw white men with dust on their boots and fear on their faces." That mattered more than his entire confession. Samuel looked toward the ridgeline where the mine country began. The Arizona afternoon had turned copper and hard. Somewhere ahead, a contractor with army cover had moved stolen gold into a dead mountain and planned to buy himself innocence with another lie about the Apache. Mara tied Toland's charm higher on her neck, mounted, and said, "Then we stop the lie before the lie becomes history." Samuel helped Pike onto a mule, tucked the copied notes inside his coat, and followed her north toward Argent Hollow, knowing the case had already grown larger than theft. Argent Hollow looked like the kind of place even coyotes remembered to avoid. The old mining cut opened between two jagged walls of volcanic stone, a black mouth above a slope of rusted scrap and weathered beams silvered by time. Wind moved through broken timbers with a thin organ note that would have sounded supernatural to anyone eager for superstition. Samuel understood at once why Mercer had chosen it. The mine was remote, defensible, and close enough to the sacred basin that every strange echo could be blamed on Apache spirits by men who preferred legends to investigations. They made camp in a shallow shelf a quarter-mile below the entrance until the last light drained from the sky. Pike slept from exhaustion. Samuel sat beside a low flame drinking bitter coffee that Mara somehow made taste cleaner than the depot brew he had known all his life. In the orange light her face looked both younger and older, the features of a woman who had learned to measure men by what they ignored. "You expected an attack," she said quietly. Samuel did not pretend otherwise. "I expected the most likely frontier answer. And now?" He looked toward the mine. "Now I think the frontier answer is often the laziest one." Mara almost smiled. She told him the listening ground had been sacred long before American surveyors named it. Chiricahua families left offerings there when journeys crossed difficult country because the basin taught humility. Sound returned from the wrong place. Footsteps seemed nearer or farther than they were. A proud traveler mistook his own noise for truth and got lost. "It is not a curse," she said. "It is a lesson men keep refusing." Samuel admitted that army maps flattened too much: land, people, motive, consequence. He had joined the army believing order could protect the frontier from chaos. Instead, he had found that paperwork sometimes escorted chaos and called it progress. Mara nodded toward Pike sleeping in a curl of blanket, and said that weak men with pens could do as much damage as strong men with rifles if they signed the wrong story. Before midnight they moved closer, circling the hollow under a moon pale enough to turn every stone into bone. At the entrance they found cart grooves, mule droppings no more than a day old, and the unmistakable smell of hot lamp oil. Mercer was inside. So was at least part of the gold. Samuel wanted to rush the opening with the element of surprise, but Mara caught his sleeve and tilted her head. Deep in the tunnel a whistle drifted upward, long and hollow, the exact call of a locomotive. Pike bolted awake behind them with a gasp. Samuel's pulse jumped even though reason told him no engine could be running in a dead silver mine. Mara put a finger to her lips and waited. The whistle came again, then fractured into 3 notes that bounced around the canyon until direction lost its meaning. Samuel understood then what Toland meant. In this country sound was not proof. It was bait. They crouched near the entrance and studied the rock face until Samuel noticed a slit high above the portal where wind poured through an old ventilation shaft. Mercer's men had rigged metal piping somewhere inside. They had turned the mountain itself into theater. Clever, Samuel thought, but not clever enough. On the ground below the shaft Mara found a fresh footprint beside a dropped ration tin stamped with a civilian supplier's seal from Tucson. Samuel pocketed the tin and felt the case tightening into something he could finally present to the world. Then Mara touched the stone, just inside the entrance, and withdrew her hand. "Water," she whispered. A cool thread was running along the tunnel floor from deeper inside. Storm water trapped somewhere in the old mine. Samuel looked at the moon, then at the black band of clouds building over the eastern mesas. Mercer had hidden stolen gold in a mountain that still remembered rain. If the storm broke before dawn, the hollow would become a trap. For the first time Samuel wondered whether the desert meant to judge greed without waiting for the army to do its duty. They entered Argent Hollow just before dawn, stepping around collapsed rail, shattered ore carts, and timbers that smelled of wet dust and old pennies. Mara moved first, lantern hooded low, reading the tunnel with the same patience she used on open country. Samuel followed with notebook in one pocket and revolver in the other, though he hoped to use either. The first chamber had once been a sorting room. Mercer had remade it into a criminal office. A field desk stood against the wall. Army stencils, cargo sheets, spare switch plates, and a crate of mirror signals were stacked with insulting neatness. Samuel opened a ledger and felt his jaw tighten as page after page confirmed what Pike had described. Fuel costs disguised as maintenance. Civilian labor charged to Army emergency funds. Portable track sections listed as drainage hardware. Half the gold marked for delivery to Fort Mason had been reassigned on paper to a route that did not exist. Mercer's signature appeared beside every clever lie. Worse, Colonel Barrett's initials appeared in the margin of 2 dispatch copies, small and hurried but unmistakable. Samuel had wanted incompetence. He had wanted forgery. He had not wanted betrayal from inside the command structure. Mara found the first chest in a side alcove beneath a tarp, heavy iron corner stamped with the United States mark. Its lid was sealed but scratched where someone had tested the lock. There should have been 40 chests. They found 7 in that chamber, 3 more in a side drift, and drag marks leading deeper into the mine. Enough to prove theft, not enough to solve it. At the back of the room a narrow-gauge handcar sat on fresh rails descending through a blasted tunnel Samuel did not see on any survey. Mercer had extended the mine. He kept moving the gold. Farther in, Samuel said, as if he expected inspection, or as if he meant to divide it. Mara answered. On a nail above the handcar hung something that startled them both into stillness. It was an old beaded charm darkened by age, another his knees at, but far older than the one Tolan had given Mara. She touched it with careful fingers and said her grandmother had once told her of leaving protection tokens near dangerous places where outsiders mistook greed for courage. Samuel asked whether Mercer knew what it meant. Mara looked down the shadowed rails. He did not need to. He only needed to ignore it. From deeper in the mine came the murmur of men arguing, then a scrape of metal on stone. Samuel extinguished the lantern and motioned Pike and the mule handler, Sergeant Daniel Price, into cover near the desk. Price had joined them before dawn after Samuel sent a coded note back through a relay rider, the one enlisted man Samuel trusted to favor truth over rank. In the dark Samuel unfolded Mercer's ledger again and tore out the pages bearing Barrett's initials, not to destroy them but to keep them on his body if the desk was burned or the room flooded. His training told him evidence mattered more than emotion. His heartbeat answered that betrayal mattered more than both. Mara leaned close enough for him to hear her whisper over the dripping water. When we face him, do not let him turn this into Apache against soldier. He wants that story more than the gold. Samuel nodded. Somewhere beyond the bend, Mercer was still moving treasure through a mountain that had begun to fill with storm water, and the only thing more dangerous than his plan was the possibility that he still believed he controlled it. The tunnel narrowed into a throat of dark stone, then opened without warning into a chamber so large the lantern light seemed embarrassed by it. Above them, ancient mining cuts disappeared into black height. Below, a shallow pool reflected timbers, rails, and the restless gold flicker of hidden lamps farther ahead. Mercer's men had turned the chamber into a staging ground. 2 wagons stood ready on planked ramps, not full-size freight wagons but compact or haulers that could be disassembled and carried through the service cut to the north side of the hill. Samuel understood the scheme. At once. Mercer never intended to keep the train intact. He intended to break the crime into pieces small enough to survive inspection, sell the golden fragments, and let the public imagination supply Apache raiders where paperwork needed cover. Yet the mountain refused to stay ordinary. Every word spoken at one end of the chamber came back altered from another. Water dripped on a delay that made time feel crooked. At the center of the floor a ring of dry dust remained untouched while mud spread everywhere else, as though some invisible wheel had turned there and then disappeared. Samuel knelt beside it. No track led in or out. He had no explanation. Mara watched him with an unreadable expression and said, "You do not need one for every stone before sunrise." She was right, and the reminder irritated him only because it sounded like wisdom. They recovered 4 more gold chests near the pool and found the payroll lockbox with Samuel's own movement order tucked inside. Mercer had kept every paper that could be twisted into innocence. Sergeant Price whispered that he had seen 2 armed laborers farther ahead, and 1 civilian clerk with Mercer. Samuel answered that they would not force a confrontation until they had the ledgers, the lockbox, and a living witness ready. He wanted Mercer trapped by proof, not by heroics. Then, from the far side of the chamber, a blue lamp flared and a voice drifted back clearly enough to freeze them all. It was Mercer, calm and irritated, talking about weather, mules, and delivery schedules as if he were arranging lumber rather than stolen army gold. He ordered the final chests moved to the listening room before the flood channel rose. Samuel frowned. The name came from Toland's warning, not army maps. Mercer knew more about the basin than he should. Mara's face sharpened. "My people do not speak that name to outsiders." Samuel looked toward the light. "Then someone sold him knowledge with the land." They eased along the wall until they could see into the adjoining chamber. Mercer stood beside a field table, coat off, sleeves rolled, handsome in the polished way Eastern money often arrived in the territory, with his hair too careful and his boots too expensive for honest labor. Beside him lay survey sheets, a sealed army envelope, and a heap of silver coins set apart from the gold as if he enjoyed the symbolism. Samuel hated him instantly, not because Mercer looked cruel, but because he looked pleased. The contractor spoke with a courier wearing Colonel Barrett's insignia dusted into anonymity by travel. There it was, the final link Samuel had not wanted. A private conspiracy under public authority. Before Samuel could shift position, the courier mentioned that the punitive report against local Chiricahua families was already drafted. Once the missing train became an Apache attack, patrols would enter the basin, new rail rights would be justified, and Mercer's investors would control both transport and the story told about it. Mara's hand tightened around the old charm at her throat. Samuel could feel the moment tilting toward anger, but she did not move. She waited, listening the way the land listened, gathering every word that could later survive denial. The longer Samuel stood beside her in the dark, the more he understood that her discipline was not hesitation. It was strategy. Mercer had built his theft on assumption that the army would choose convenience, that the public would choose prejudice, and that the desert would choose silence. He was wrong on at least one count already. Mara leaned near Samuel and whispered, "Now we know what truth must beat." He nodded, and somewhere overhead thunder rolled so deeply through the mind that even Mercer stopped speaking long enough to look up. Samuel wanted to arrest Mercer that instant. The ledgers were in his coat, the lockbox was under Price's arm, Pike could identify the contractor, and Price could swear to the courier's insignia. That was the straight army answer. Mara did not argue against it. She only pointed to the water now threading around their boots and the timber groaning above the chamber. "If we force him now," she whispered, "he will burn what he can and seal the rest behind a flood. Truth buried in mud is still buried." Samuel hated that she was right. They withdrew the way they had come, slow, controlled, carrying the documents, one chest seal, and enough physical proof to make denial expensive. Outside, dawn had vanished beneath a ceiling of bruised cloud. The hollow smelled of wet stone and lightning. Pike trembled not from fear of Mercer anymore, but from fear that the mountain itself meant to close over the crime before anyone could speak it aloud. Samuel sent Price with Pike and the evidence to the relay post at Dry Creek under strict instruction that no report was to pass through Colonel Barrett's office. Price hesitated only once, asking whether this meant disobeying command. Samuel answered with the only sentence that still felt clean. It means obeying the truth before rank. When Price rode off, Mara led Samuel toward a line of low wickups hidden in juniper folds west of the basin where several Chiricahua families were packing quietly for temporary movement. News traveled faster than telegraph when a sacred place became restless. Tolan Nantan stood under a Ramada roof, watching the storm build over Black Mesa, and listened as Samuel finally laid out Mercer's scheme without softening any part of it. The old man did not look surprised. White men built a lie from the oldest habit. Mara translated after Samuel finished. Take what is not yours, then blame the people who remember what was there first. Tolan then explained the listening room. Long before miners cut Argent Hollow, water had carved a hidden channel beneath the basin. In heavy rain it filled suddenly, and the stone amplified every sound until direction failed. Travelers who chased voices instead of reading ground walked themselves into trouble. That was why the place was sacred. It punished arrogance, not by magic, but by removing certainty. Samuel admitted that he had spent most of his career mistaking certainty for intelligence. Tolan almost smiled. He told Mara that if Mercer remained in the mine after the first hard rain, the mountain would keep part of his greed whether he agreed or not. Samuel asked whether there was another exit. Tolan nodded toward the northern ridge. An old haul road rose behind the listening room and dropped toward Assault Flat. If Mercer moved the last chest before the flood, he would use that route. That knowledge changed everything. Samuel no longer needed to charge blindly into the hollow. He could trap Mercer between evidence, weather, and geography. Yet one danger remained larger than the man himself. If Colonel Barrett issued the punitive patrol order before Samuel surfaced with proof, Chiricahua families near the basin would suffer for a theft they did not commit. Samuel borrowed the settlement's signaling mirror and rode with Mara to a telegraph relay shack perched above Dry Creek, arriving just as the operator prepared Barrett's outgoing wire. Samuel read the message and felt his stomach harden. It blamed hostile interference by local Apache bands and authorized immediate movement toward their camps. Barrett was already converting theft into policy. Samuel copied the dispatch, forced the operator to hold transmission under Army authority, and signed his own name below the cancellation with a hand steadier than he felt. That act, more than any hidden spur or stolen chest, marked the point of no return. He was no longer merely solving a mystery. He was choosing which version of the frontier would become record. When he rode back to Mara through the first cold drops of rain, she did not ask whether he had succeeded. She looked at his face and knew. Together they turned toward the North Road, where Mercer would soon try to outrun not only the storm, but the story he had written for everyone else. By late afternoon the desert had changed from a theater of heat into a machine-gathering force. Wind ran low over the flats, flattening grass and gray waves, and the rails on the distant main line sang now and then with a thin metallic hum that made every trooper at Dry Creek glance east. Samuel used the relay post as if it were a courtroom built from boards and wire. He laid Mercer's ledger on the operator's table, spread Barrett's cancelled dispatch beside it, set the payroll lockbox where everyone could see the official seal, and then asked Pike to recount the diversion from the beginning without embellishment. The clerk did so with trembling precision. Sergeant Price added what he had heard in the mine. The operator, who had spent years forwarding orders he did not question, stared at the papers with the dull shock of a man realizing that history often arrived in ordinary envelopes. Samuel requested 2 reliable deputies from the territorial marshal in Silver Bend and a wagon team to meet them at the Northern Hall Road. He did not request army support beyond Price and 3 enlisted men because Barrett would hear of any larger movement too quickly. This had become a race between proof and influence. While Samuel built the legal trap, Mara moved through the human one. She rode between Chiricahua camps with Tolan's mirror and Samuel's written assurance that no army patrol was moving against them that night. Some families chose to leave the basin. Anyway, loading blankets, clay pots, and children onto ponies with the efficient calm of people who had practiced leaving long before the army called it policy. Samuel watched from the ridge as they drifted west into safer country and understood, perhaps for the first time without defensiveness, that innocence did not spare people on the frontier from being uprooted by someone else's paperwork. At dusk Mara returned, hair damp with the first mist, carrying news that Mercer had not yet moved. One of her scouts had seen lanterns near the north exit and heard wagons being assembled below the mine. He was waiting for darkness and for men above ground to be too frightened by weather to stand in his way. Samuel unfolded the old survey and marked the haul road's descent toward the salt flat. There was a narrow shelf where wagons would have to slow to single file beside a dry cut. That would be their place. Not a battlefield. A bottleneck where facts could arrive before escape. As night settled, Samuel and Mara took position above the shelf with Price and the deputies hidden among basalt boulders below. Thunder moved closer, no longer distant enough to sound abstract. Samuel had lived his life believing that good officers prevented panic by appearing certain. Now he understood that certainty was a luxury the land rarely granted. He did not know how much gold Mercer still had, how many laborers remained loyal, or whether Barrett would try one last time to reclaim the report. He only knew the line separating justice from another frontier myth was about as wide as the wagon track beneath him. Mara crouched beside him, eyes fixed on the dark mouth of the North Road. "When he comes," she said, "he will talk first. Men like him believe words are rope." Samuel checked the copies of the ledger pages inside his coat. "Tonight they are." Rain began in scattered drops, darkening the dust. Far below, a lantern moved once between the stones, then another. Mercer was on the road at last, carrying the last of the gold toward a future he still believed could be purchased. The first wagon emerged from the North Road just after midnight, axle groaning under more weight than its size promised. 2 mules pulled it slowly onto the shelf, followed by a second smaller wagon and 3 mounted men wrapped in oilskins. Gideon Mercer rode at the center without haste, hat brim low, one hand resting on the pommel as if he were leading a supply convoy rather than fleeing a criminal scene ahead of a flood. Samuel waited until all of them were fully committed to the narrow ledge before stepping into the lantern light with Price and the deputies rising below at the same moment. Mara remained above on the basalt rim, mirror tucked away now, rifle visible but lowered. Samuel wanted the geometry of the encounter to say what frontier rumor never did. The Apache scout was not the raider. The white contractor was not the respectable man in charge. Mercer drew up the horse and actually smiled. "Lieutenant Whitaker," he said, with the warm surprise of a host interrupted at dinner. "You are saving me the trouble of explaining a regrettable Apache incident." Samuel held up the payroll lockbox in one hand and Mercer's ledger in the other. "You can explain the portable switch, the hidden spur, the forged maintenance order, and Colonel Barrett's initials later." For the first time Mercer's face lost polish. Not much. Just enough to show calculation replacing charm. He glanced at the ledge ahead, the deputies behind, the storm above. "You think papers will protect you," he said. "By morning the army will prefer my version. A vanished train, frightened clerks, local hostility, a dead mine. Men in Washington understand efficiency, not desert poetry." Mara spoke then from the ridge, her voice carrying with the strange clarity the basin always gave truth at the wrong moment for liars. "You have spent more time inventing Apache ghosts than learning the land beneath your boots." Mercer looked up at her, and Samuel saw the exact instant he recognized that the person he had expected to frame had become the witness who could undo him. Mercer began talking faster, trying to turn every sentence into a bargain. He said Barrett had only approved a temporary diversion. He said the gold would have been returned quietly after an audit. He said the territory needed rail expansion more than it needed moral sermons. He said the Apache would have been blamed only on paper, as if paper did not move soldiers and burn futures. Samuel let him keep speaking because every excuse thickened the noose of his own logic. When Mercer finally tried a simpler argument, that frontier progress always required a few useful lies, Samuel answered by handing Price the copied dispatch canceling Barrett's patrol order. "Your useful lie is already failing," he said. Mercer's laborers shifted uneasily. One looked back toward the mine as if he could hear the water rising from miles away. Another slid from his saddle and raised empty hands, done with loyalty now that loyalty looked wet and expensive. The moment could still have broken into chaos, but the storm reached them first. Lightning opened across the mesa, white and enormous, followed by a crack so deep it seemed to come from inside the mountain. Then came the sound everyone turned to hear, not a train whistle this time, but the dull rolling thunder of floodwater forcing its way through old channels behind the ridge. Mara looked east once and said, "Argent Hollow is closing." Mercer's eyes went to the wagons, to the chests hidden under tarps, to the ledge too narrow for speed and too exposed for stubbornness. Samuel expected denial. Instead he saw panic, the kind greed never rehearses. Samuel gave him one honest order. "Leave the gold and walk out alive." Mercer hesitated long enough for the rain to become a sheet. Then, at last, he dismounted. The gold stayed on the wagons. The lie stayed with him. And somewhere behind the ridge, the mountain began taking back whatever men had no time left to claim. The shelf road became a river of mud in less than 10 minutes. Samuel had seen flash floods before, but never in country that seemed moments earlier as dry as bone. Water poured down side channels, turning dust to slick clay and forcing men who had spent hours deceiving one another into the older work of simple survival. Price and the deputies cut the mules loose before the wagons could drag them over the edge. Mara moved first and fastest, not toward the gold but toward the laborer at the rear whose boot had jammed between stones. She freed him with a lever of driftwood and sent him scrambling uphill without a single wasted word. Samuel took Mercer by the arm when the contractor froze at the sight of one loaded wagon slipping sideways under its own weight. "It is done," Samuel said. Mercer stared as if disbelief might anchor it. The wagon tipped, slid, and vanished into the roaring dark below, carrying at least 6 chests with it. No bright treasure flashed. No dramatic shower of coins appeared. The desert swallowed value without ceremony. The remaining wagon held longer, but the ledge itself was unraveling. Mara directed everyone toward a basalt shelf 30 feet above the road where an old game trail cut back through the rock. One by one they climbed, soaked, muddied, stripped of rank and story. Mercer nearly went down when a section of the trail broke under him. Samuel caught his sleeve. It was not mercy exactly. It was refusal to let the man turn himself into a convenient martyr. Above them, lightning revealed black mesa and hard white plains, beautiful and indifferent. Below them, the last wagon cracked apart against a boulder, spilling one chest into a side channel where it lodged briefly, then disappeared into the flood cut that led back toward the listening ground. Mara watched it go without surprise. "The land keeps what men force on it," she said. By dawn the rain had eased enough for them to descend carefully toward the salt flat. They recovered 12 chests, 3 partial crates, Mercer's survey tubes, and 2 more ledgers sealed in oilcloth. It was less gold than the army had lost, more proof than Samuel had hoped to save, and exactly the kind of incomplete answer that lets legends survive. Mercer, shivering and humbled into silence, finally asked how much of the missing treasure remained in the mine. Mara looked east where storm mist still held the ridges in layers of gray. "Enough to make men return," she said. Samuel did not love that answer, but he knew truth when he heard its unwelcome shape. The frontier was full of endings that refused to close neatly. What mattered now was that Mercer was alive to testify. Barrett's order had been interrupted, and the first official report could no longer honestly say the Apache had raided the train. As the sun rose pale over the washed flats, Samuel looked at Mara and understood that the mystery had changed. The question was no longer how the train vanished. The question was whether the territory would accept a solution that left some gold missing and all its comfortable prejudice exposed. Frontier justice preferred distance from embarrassment, so the inquiry was held not in the capital but in a drafty administrative hall at Silver Bend where the walls smelled of ink, wet wool, and old varnish. Samuel stood before a 3-man board in his clean but still weather-stained uniform and presented the case the way he wished the frontier always worked, document by document, witness by witness, without the mercy of dramatic simplification. Mercer's ledger established the hidden spur. Pike's testimony established the forged diversion. Sergeant Price confirmed the conversation in Argent Hollow. The relay operator produced Barrett's cancelled dispatch. 2 recovered chests matched the missing payroll inventory by serial mark. When Colonel Barrett finally arrived, he carried himself with offended dignity rather than fear, which Samuel found almost more troubling. Barrett claimed he had only approved emergency discretion in a difficult territory and had never authorized theft or false blame. Mercer, seeing the chance to trade arrogance for survival, testified that Barrett had provided cover but not design. It was not the clean collapse Samuel wanted. It was the frontier version, partial honesty cut for advantage. Yet even partial honesty was enough to stop the worst lie. The board could not maintain an Apache raid narrative once every physical proof pointed elsewhere. The final military language was timid, mechanical, and determined to sound smaller than the event had been. Criminal diversion of federal property. Unauthorized use of auxiliary track. Administrative failure under frontier conditions. Samuel almost laughed when he heard it read aloud. A vanished gold train through sacred land had been reduced to clerical nouns. Still, one sentence mattered. No evidence of hostile action by Chiricahua Apache parties. Mara attended only one day of the hearing. She refused the chair offered to her, and stood instead near the back window where light fell across her buckskin cuffs and silver amulet. When asked for a statement, she did not speak of curses or spirits, or even Mercer by name. She said only that land remembers what papers omit, and that people who blame the innocent to protect profit do not merely steal gold, they steal the road between memory and truth. Several men in the room looked annoyed because her words could not be filed easily. Samuel knew that meant they would survive. Barrett resigned before formal censure could reach him. Mercer was remanded for federal prosecution. The recovered gold was sealed, inventoried, and sent east under a guard twice the size of the original escort, a gesture so anxious it bordered on comedy. Samuel received neither promotion nor punishment, which in frontier terms meant his superiors had decided he was useful but inconvenient. Mara received an offer of compensation for cooperation and turned it down with a glance that made the paymaster blush. What she asked for instead was smaller, stranger, and more permanent. She wanted the basin around the listening ground marked closed to new rail work. The board refused to recognize sacred language, but Samuel used the flood damage reports, unstable rock surveys, and Mercer's illegal excavation records to force a practical equivalent. No new line crossed Black Mesa that year. Some nights that seemed like justice. Other nights it felt like only a pause. When the hearing ended and the crowd drifted away, Samuel found Mara outside beside the hitch rail. The Arizona light had turned the town dusty gold, the color men chased until it owned them. "The report still lies by how little it says," he told her. Mara mounted without hurry. "Then do not let the report be the only story," she answered. It was not a request. It was a charge. Samuel watched her ride west toward open country, and understood that official truth had been won only halfway. The rest would have to live in memory, voice, and the part of the desert that still kept what had not been rightfully claimed. 20 years later, long after uniforms changed cut and rail maps thickened across the territory, Samuel Whitaker returned to Black Mesa with more gray in his beard and less faith in the permanence of official records. He was no longer an army lieutenant. Life had sanded that title away, leaving him with notebooks, a repaired limp from another posting, and a habit of studying margins as carefully as headlines. The basin looked smaller than memory, and larger than history. Wind moved through the stone shoulders with the same patient voice it had always possessed. No main line crossed the listening ground. A survey stake or two still leaned in the brush, relics of plans never finished. Somewhere beneath the northern cut, perhaps in Argent Hollow, perhaps in some deeper channel only floodwater knew, part of the missing payroll still rested beyond inventory. Treasure men had searched for it for years. They came with fresh shovels, fresher greed, and stories sharpened by distance. Most left with broken tools, bad directions, or the unsettling feeling that the land disliked being treated as rumor. Samuel had come for none of that. He came because he had promised himself that if memory survived him, it would not survive only as an Apache curse told by men who still preferred prejudice to explanation. He found Mara Nan before sunset on a high shelf above the wash, older now but still possessing that dangerous calm that once made armed men lower their voices. A line of younger riders waited below her with pack animals and water skins, family by the look of them, the next generation learning routes older than every American report filed about the place. Samuel handed Mara a copy of the private account he had finally written, not for newspapers hungry for spectacle, but for archives that might one day deserve honesty. She turned the pages slowly, nodded once, and asked whether he had written the missing gold as mystery or temptation. "Both," he said. "Because both are true." They stood together as twilight spread across Arizona in long violet bands. Far away, on a section of active track miles west, a real locomotive gave a faint call. The echo reached the basin fractured and delayed until for one brief impossible instant it sounded like the lost train returning through stone. One of the younger riders looked up sharply. Samuel smiled without humor. "There is your legend," he said. Mara shook her head. "No. The legend is what people choose because it asks less of them than the truth." Then she spoke the truth one final time, plain and unsheltered. The train did not vanish by magic. It was stolen by men who trusted greed, paperwork, and racial blame. Yet the land had judged them in its own older language. It broke their certainty, swallowed part of their prize, and left behind just enough unanswered pieces to keep the story alive. Samuel knew that was the frontier in one sentence. Nothing ended cleanly. Nothing stayed buried completely. As darkness settled, campfires began to glow below like low red stars. Samuel closed his notebook and listened to the basin breathe. Somewhere under the stone lay gold the army never reclaimed. Somewhere in military files lay reports that still said too little. And somewhere between those two failures, the real story remained, carried not by rail, rank, or rumor, but by the memory of an Apache scout, a white officer who chose the harder record, and a desert that never once confused silence with innocence.